Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. The humidity of the sub-levels of the Miskatonic University Library was a physical thing, a heavy velvet curtain that muffled sound and clung to the skin. It smelled of ozone, old paper, and something metallic. The ghost of ancient plumbing, perhaps, or the silent bleed of ferrous materials deep within the granite bedrock. Elias Thorne, a research archivist in his late 20s, whose natural pallor made him look perpetually startled, barely registered the discomfort anymore. He was a creature of the sub-levels, navigating its endless, windowless aisles with the practiced, somnambulant ease of a sleepwalker. His current project, assigned to him by the enigmatic Dr. Alistair Vane, involved cataloging the contents of the restricted B section, a series of forgotten vaults beneath the main library that had been sealed off since the 1930s following a minor, highly publicized incident involving a fire, a missing graduate student, and rumors of unauthorized ritualism. Officially, it was moisture damage that kept it closed. Unofficially, Elias knew the truth was far older and slipperier than simple water. He stood before Vault 37. It wasn't a door, but a massive iron, sheathed slab of oak reinforced with steel bands, fastened by a lock the size of a dinner plate. The key, a heavy brass serpentine relic that felt cold even when cradled in his palm, was one of only two in existence. Dr. Vane possessed the other. Elias inserted the key. The tumblers ground against one another with a shriek that sounded less like metal on metal and more like 1,000 whispers being dragged across rough silk. The sound traveled far too easily in the stillness, and Elias flinched, glancing quickly down the long, shadowed aisle. Nothing but the endless stacks, their spines brittle and dusted with fine, black motes of forgotten history. The door groaned inward, releasing a blast of air that was somehow colder and damper than the rest of the subterranean network. Elias switched on the halogen lamp he carried, an essential tool, as the ambient strip lighting, installed hastily decades ago, only flickered weakly, creating more shadow than illumination. Vault 37 was not what he expected. Instead of neat rows of labeled boxes or shelves lined with forbidden texts, it was a single, enormous room dominated by a low stone table, its surface scratched and stained, looking more like an altar than a workspace. And piled upon this table, and spilling onto the floor in anarchic, cascading mounds, were notebooks, thousands of them. They weren't the leather, bound, gilt, edged volumes Miskatonic was famous for. These were cheap, dime, store exercise books, spiral, bound composition notebooks, and loose sheaves of graph paper, all discolored to the shade of old bone. What distinguished them was the handwriting. It was relentless, covering every square inch of every page in ink ranging from faded violet to deep, dried rust, or something that looked disturbingly like rust. The script itself was frantic, often curving up or down the page, margins as if trying to escape the confines of the paper. Elias had been asked to create a preliminary index. He took a deep, steadying breath, placed his lamp on the stone table, and pulled on a pair of conservation gloves. He picked up the topmost book, a small red ledger with a peeling vinyl cover. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting, though tight, was initially legible. The entry was dated 1927. The problem is not what is seen, but the absence of what should be there. They talk of shadows, but a shadow requires light. This is not shadow. This is subtraction. The colors are wrong. The air tastes of copper and the geometry of the room is failing. I feel it in my teeth. The others, they call it madness, but they haven't held the angles. They haven't held the angles. They haven't too heard the static between the words. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. This wasn't T standard research material. He flipped through the ledger, the pages thin and brittle. The entries became shorter, the handwriting larger, more desperate. Lines began to blur. Then, halfway through, the entries stopped being descriptions and started being symbols. Not symbols from any known language or even recognizable occult script. They were dense, intricate patterns that seemed to shift on the page if he stared too long. They resembled knotwork or microscopic biological structures, rendered with impossible precision. He placed the red ledger back down and picked up a spiral notebook. This one was entirely filled with what seemed at first glance to be mathematical equations, differential calculus, topology, and advanced physics, but scattered among the X, S, and Y. S were characters that looked like Greek letters, mutated by a parasitic disease, alpha with too many legs, omega with an extra loop. One particular page caught his eye. It contained a perfect, non-Euclidean spiral drawn in a thick, black substance that cracked slightly when he carefully turned the page. Around the spiral, one sentence was scrawled repeatedly, dozens of times, until it descended into a near, unintelligible line of gibberish. The sentence read, "The key is the silence between the heartbeats of God." As Elias finished reading, the halogen lamp on the table sputtered, casting the symbols into rapid, flickering motion. A deep, almost subsonic vibration resonated through the floor, making his chest cavity hum unpleasantly. It was not a mechanical sound. It sounded like something enormous settling, or perhaps something equally enormous waking. He looked up toward the heavy iron door of Vault 37. It was still wide open, just as he had left it. But the darkness beyond the threshold, the common darkness of the library basement, now looked different. It looked thicker. It looked interested. Elias clutched the spiral notebook. The strange black spiral pressed against his palm through the conservation glove. He had found his first document, but the unsettling truth was that he had a terrifying feeling. It had also found him. This was not merely an index he was building. It was an inventory of a creeping, cognitive sickness, and he was now the assigned courier. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his stomach, that to properly index these materials, he would first have to truly understand them, and understanding them meant letting the frantic, desperate thoughts of their previous writers take root in his own mind. He knew he shouldn't. T read another word, but the red ledger with its tale of subtraction and failing geometry was already whispering, its edges slightly curved in a way that suggested an eagerness to be opened again. He had 99 more chapters to go, and the first lesson of Vault 37 was already clear. Obedience always comes at a price. The vibration subsided, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the vault. Elias stood motionless for a full minute, listening to the static echo in his own ears. The lamp had stabilized, casting its harsh white cone across the chaos of books. He blinked, trying to rationalize the experience. A localized tremor, old infrastructure, perhaps a high-frequency noise. He misidentified. He was alone, and yet felt profoundly, impossibly observed. Elias was an archivist. His life was built on structure, on the meticulous application of the Dewey Decimal System, on accession numbers and provenance. He dealt in facts: who wrote it, when, why, and where it belonged. The task now was to apply this logic to the thousands of notebooks before him, a task that immediately revealed itself to be an act of profound intellectual futility. He pulled a blank archival tag and a pen from his satchel. He designated the spiral notebook with the black spiral as document a -37 -001, archival, vault 37, first document, title. Elias paused. The notebook had no cover title. He couldn't T-title it. Advanced Mathematics, because of the mutated Greek symbols. He could T-title it Occult Musings, because the core was demonstrably calculus. He settled on topological study with non-Euclidean glyphs and repetitive phrase. It was sterile, clinical, and utterly dishonest about the palpable terror the book exuded. Author, unknown. The script was frantic, but consistent throughout. Date of composition, undated. The materials were clearly pre-1930s, aligning with the vault. S closure, but that gave him a 50-year window. Subject keywords, mathematics, topology, symbolism, cosmology, silence. Elias laughed, a dry rasping sound that startled him. He was using silence as a professional indexing term. The vault was already working on him. He moved to the red ledger, marking it document a -37 -002. Title he chose, Personal Account, Observations on Failing Geometry and Color Distortion. Author, again, unknown. But the text offered a clue. The writer spoke of the others, a group. An internal investigation years ago had mentioned a researcher named Professor Silas Alston, who had disappeared from the campus in 1931, the same year the vaults were sealed. Alston was a polymath, linguistics, philosophy, and, critically, non-linear mathematics. Elias felt a morbid fascination click into place. If this entire pile represented the accumulated notes of Alston, and perhaps his inner circle, then it was a journal of a slow, comprehensive descent into an abyss of the mind. He decided to focus on the structure. He pulled a few dozen books off the table and began to categorize them by physical appearance: small ledgers, composition books, graph paper pads. As he organized, he noticed a startling pattern in the pile beneath. All the notebooks, regardless of size or color, seemed to be converging toward a single point beneath the stone table. He knelt, shining his lamp underneath the massive slab. The floor was rough, unpolished granite, and directly in the center, underneath where the books had rested, was a shallow, bowl-shaped indentation. It wasn't natural wear. It looked like the place where something heavy and round, and perhaps once alive, had been pressed into the stone for decades. More disturbing, the very edges of the stone table where they met the floor didn't appear to be resting perfectly flat. The plane of the table and the plane of the floor seemed to intersect at an angle that his eye insisted was wrong, that his brain refused to process as a right angle. It wasn't dramatically skewed, but the subtle, almost imperceptible misalignment gave him vertigo. Alston's words returned to him. The geometry of the room is failing. Elias quickly retreated, standing up and closing his eyes, counting backward from 10. He took off the gloves, careful not to touch the books directly. He needed to leave, process the sheer volume, and, more importantly, report the nature of the contents to Dr. Vane. He grabbed the 2 indexed notebooks and his lamp and hurried toward the door. He did. T-lock Vault 37. The thought of that awful shriek of grinding metal echoing again was too much. He simply pulled the heavy iron slab shut, the sound a dull, wooden thud, and secured the sliding bolt. The journey back up through the stacks was a confusing blur. The long, shadowy aisles, which moments ago had seemed comforting in their familiar mustiness, now felt like the interior of a massive, cold engine. He passed the ambient strip lights. Instead of their usual weak yellow glow, Elias swore that for just an instant, the light above him winked out, and was replaced by a brief flicker of a color that did not exist. It was a dark, purple, black hue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He stumbled into the main archive office, a brightly lit room that usually felt sterile and safe. Today, the fluorescent tubes hummed too loudly, the white walls were too sharp, and the clean lines of the desks looked like brittle, imposed lies. Dr. Vane was waiting. He sat behind his large mahogany desk, dressed in his usual perfectly tailored tweed suit, sipping tea from a delicate china cup. Dr. Vane was older, perhaps mid-50s, with thin, gray hair combed back meticulously. His most notable feature was his eyes, pale, almost colorless, and utterly devoid of warmth or curiosity. They merely assessed. "Well, Thorne?" Vane asked, his voice low and precise, like the ticking of an expensive clock. Elias placed the two notebooks on the desk. "Sir, Ivy secured the vault. The contents are not what we expected. It is not standard archival material. It is personal notes, thousands of them, and highly disturbed." Vane did. He looked at the books. He looked at Elias' face, tracing the exhaustion and the fear in his features. Vane repeated, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Please elaborate, Mr. Thorne. Give me your professional assessment. What is the subject matter of a negative 37 negative, 001, and a negative 37 negative 002? Elias hesitated. "How do you describe the logic of subtraction to a man whose only interest is the balance sheet of reality?" "A negative 37 negative 002, Elias began, wetting his lips, details sensory and cognitive distortions. "The author speaks of failing geometry and a not shadow. It tracks a profound shift in perception starting around 1927. The later half switches to non-linguistic symbolic patterns, suggesting the breakdown of conventional communication, and a negative 37 negative 001?" Vane prompted. "A negative 37 negative 001 is predominantly mathematical, advanced, non-linear equations, sir. But interspersed are symbols, corruptions of the Greek alphabet, and it repeats a singular phrase. The key is the silence between the heartbeats of God." Vane finally looked down at the notebooks, not with curiosity, but with a kind of clinical recognition. "The way a butcher regards a cut of meat." "Indeed," Vane murmured, taking a slow sip of tea. "The archives are merely the residue of human pursuit, Thorne. Sometimes the pursuit takes one beyond the safe boundaries of the verifiable. Your task remains the same: catalog the contents, organize the residue. Sir, this material isn't just a record of madness. I believe it as contagious. The spatial awareness in the vault, a confined space, poor lighting, intense concentration." Vane interrupted smoothly. "Symptoms of fatigue, Mr. Thorne. You are an archivist, not a psychiatrist. Your job is to index the words, not interpret the delusions behind them. I want 10 index documents by tomorrow morning." Vane picked up the spiral notebook, turning it over in his hand. His gaze drifted to the black, cracked spiral on the page. He ran a gloved finger over the thick, dark substance. And as for the silence, Vane continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but losing none of its precision. "Perhaps you should listen closer. Sometimes the most important knowledge is what is subtracted from your understanding, not added to it. Now, go home. Get some rest. The vault is waiting." Elias turned to leave. the phrase subtraction echoing in his skull. As he reached the door, Vane called out, "One more thing, Thorn." Elias turned back. "I need to know the origin of the substance used to draw that spiral. It's highly unusual. Check the chemical composition of the ink when you return. Use the spectrometer in the conservation lab." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He knew, with a certainty that defied all scientific reason, that the substance was not ink, but he also knew, with cold dread, that his job required him to find out exactly what it was. He left the office, stepping back into a world that suddenly felt thin, as if the true reality was now confined solely to the darkness of Vault 37, and everything else was just a pale imitation. The assignment had been accepted. The descent had begun. The conservation lab was a cathedral of modernity compared to the subterranean mustiness of the restricted B section. It occupied the cleanest, best lit corner of the library's ground floor, a place of gleaming stainless steel, fume hoods, and the quiet hum of calibrated instruments. Elias crossed the threshold, clutching the spiral notebook, a negative 37 negative 001, like a volatile explosive. The book itself felt heavier now, its cover inexplicably colder to the touch than the ambient air. He went directly to the Fourier transform infrared spectrometer, IFTER, the workhorse of chemical analysis in the lab. Its function was elegant in its simplicity. It shone infrared light onto a sample and measured how the light was absorbed, generating a unique spectral fingerprint of the material. S molecular structure for standard inks, carbon black, iron gall, lampblack. The results were instantaneous and definitive. Elias used a microsampler to lift the tiniest speck of the black, cracked substance from the spiral S edge. It flaked away with surprising resistance, adhering to the glass slide in a stubborn, oily smear. He placed the sample in the FTIR and initiated the scan. The machine whirred to life, its internal mechanisms clicking with scientific precision. The data began to populate the adjacent monitor, forming a jagged green line against a black background. It was immediately and profoundly wrong. The spectrum had peaks that indicated organic compounds, strong spikes suggesting proteins, and long, chain fats, but they were shifted, distorted, and clustered in arrangements that defied the standard library of known organic materials. The machine was trying to match the fingerprint, scrolling through thousands of common substances: carbon, lignin, albumin, blood, shellac, soot. Each comparison failed, showing a confidence match of less than 1%. The substance was merely unusual. As Vane had suggested, it was chemically impossible. The strongest signature, dominating the entire spectrum, was an enormous absorption spike that suggested a density of complex amino acids, far beyond anything found in standard biological samples. But this was immediately contradicted by the complete absence of certain essential elements that should accompany such high protein content. It was a molecular structure that seemed to have been violently stripped of its necessary scaffolding. It was a body without a skeleton, yet perfectly held together. Elias reran the test, convinced of user error. The results were identical. He checked the machine's calibration. Perfect. He checked the background scan. Pristine. He finally zoomed in on a section of the spectrum that usually denoted the presence of iron or copper, the metallic signature he had smelled so distinctly in the vault. Here, the signal was flat, a trough of complete subtraction. It was as if the substance had actively repelled any metallic atoms from its structure. He sat back, peeling off his conservation gloves. His hands were shaking. The red ledger spoke of subtraction, and now the forensic evidence confirmed it. This substance, this ink, or whatever it was not made, but unmade. It was the remaining architecture of something that had ceased to exist, retaining its shape through sheer cognitive will. He glanced down at the notebook on the lab bench. The black spiral seemed to have deepened in shade. He picked it up and saw that the black pigment had, in the minute or so he'd been analyzing it, crept slightly further into the fibers of the paper. It was still drying after decades. Elias packed the notebook away. He needed to clear his head before facing Vane. But the thought of returning to his small, predictable apartment offered no comfort. The memory of the color that did not exist, that dark purple, black hue that absorbed light, was now firmly imprinted on his retina, a silent afterimage everywhere he looked. He drove home, the late afternoon traffic blurring past his periphery. He felt intensely vulnerable, as if the concrete walls and the noise of the city were merely decorative facades hiding a greater, formless emptiness. His apartment was on the third floor of an old New England triplex, a cozy space filled with books and thrifted antique furniture. It was his anchor, but when he opened the door, the anchor felt unmoored. The light was wrong. It was too soft, too yellow. He walked into the living room, and his eye immediately landed on the bookshelf. He was methodical about his collections, always alphabetized, always shelved by genre. Yet, a large, heavy tome on architectural history was lying flat on the floor beside the bookcase. Elias was meticulous. He had not left it there. He knelt to pick it up. As he did, he noticed the small Persian rug beneath his coffee table. He had bought it because it had a bold, geometric pattern of concentric diamonds. Now, he stared at it, a knot tightening in his stomach. One of the corner diamonds was gone. Not torn, not faded, but missing, where the intricate, deep, blue wool diamond should have been. There was only a perfectly clean, rectangular patch of the aged wooden floor. The surrounding wool fibers ended abruptly, as if cut by a scalpel of impossible precision, leaving no trace of the missing fabric, not even dust. Elias ran a hand over the edge of the rug. The loss was total. A small, neat piece of the rug's pattern had been subtracted from reality. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The red ledger S entry flashed in his mind. The problem is not what is seen, but the absence of what should be there. This is not shadow. This is subtraction. He moved to the kitchen, his movements mechanical, seeking the safety of routine. He needed water. He opened the refrigerator, and the same cold, geometric dread hit him. His milk carton was on the middle shelf. Next to the eggs, it was sealed, full, but a small, perfect circle, about the size of a quarter, had been removed from the side of the cardboard carton. It was not punctured. It was excised. A two-dimensional shape removed from a three-dimensional object, leaving a clean, perfect, two-dimensional hole through which the white liquid within was clearly visible. Elias didn't touch it. He slammed the refrigerator door shut and retreated, backing slowly until his shoulder hit the living room wall. The vault hadn't just found him. It had followed him home. The corrosive logic of non-Euclidean mathematics and the philosophy of subtraction were now active principles, operating in his own apartment. The failing geometry Professor Alston had written about was no longer confined to the stone altar of Vault 37. It was a contagion carried in the molecules of impossible ink, and it was peeling the skin off Elias. It's a familiar world, piece by perfect, terrifying piece. He had to report to Dr. Vane. He had to tell him about the impossible spectroscopic results, about the disappearing carpet, about the excised milk carton. But even as he reached for the phone, he heard Vane, calm, precise voice in his mind. Your job is to index the words, not interpret the delusions behind them. I want 10 index documents by tomorrow morning. The only path to stability, the only way to perhaps contain the infection, was to complete the task. He had 8 more documents to index. He would have to return to the vault tonight. He would have to choose which other notebooks to read, which other fragments of Silas Alston's madness he would absorb into his own fracturing perception. He grabbed his satchel, his keys, and the lingering sense of the subtraction that had just occurred in his home. The night was already falling, and the library basement was waiting. Elias returned to the Miskatonic sub, levels just after midnight. The main library was locked and silent, its great reading rooms now deep, vaulted chambers of shadow. He used his access card, a privilege reserved for senior staff, and moved through the echoing silence, the fluorescent safety lights casting long, segmented shadows of the stacks ahead of him. The air here was drier, cleaner than the sub. Levels, but the illusion of safety was gone. He now knew that the structural integrity of this world was conditional, easily negated by the logic of certain thoughts. He walked past the archival office. Dr. Vane's door was locked, the mahogany surface reflecting the faint light like polished obsidian. When he reached the descent staircase, he paused. The stairwell was a corkscrew of cold, worn concrete plunging into the earth. It had always felt oppressive. Tonight, it felt like the throat of a colossal creature. He flipped his halogen lamp on, the beam cutting a thick, solid path through the humid air. He descended, the sound of his own worn leather shoes on the concrete steps, a series of sharp, lonely cracks that seemed to dissolve instantly into the profound silence below. Reaching the vault corridor, Elias stopped again. The ambient strip lighting that ran down the center of the main aisle was now behaving differently. Instead of the weak, steady yellow glow he was used to, the lights were cycling, not flickering. They would hold the weak yellow for exactly 5 seconds, then switch instantly to a color that did not exist, a brief, black, purple pulse that lasted for less than 1/10 of a second before snapping back to yellow. This happened with unwavering, rhythmic precision. 5 seconds yellow, flash of the impossible color, 5 seconds yellow. It was a slow, pulsing beat, a deliberate, agonizing cadence of static. It was the sound of the silence between the words. Elias found himself walking to the rhythm. His feet landed in sync with the yellow light. He passed through the dark, subtracted flash, and stepped into the next yellow pool. It felt like walking through a series of discrete, interrupted frames of reality. He reached Vault 37. The iron door was secured by the bolt, just as he had left it. He pulled the bolt back. The sound was a deafening metallic screech in the silence, and carefully nudged the door open. The air inside was the same cold, damp exhalation as before. He played his lamp over the stone altar. The thousands of notebooks were exactly where they had been, stacked, piled, and scattered. But now, with the rhythmic pulsing from the corridor lights invading the vault, the chaos seemed intentional, a landscape arranged by a mind for whom disorder was the only truth. Elias set up his workspace quickly, placing his lamp on the corner of the stone table, aiming it at a clean patch of floor. He needed 8 more documents. He decided to categorize them not by title or author, but by ink type. He would start with the ones that used the deep, dried rust color. He pulled out 4 slender, olive green notebooks, tied them together with an archival ribbon. and designated them a negative 37 negative 003 through a negative 37 negative 006. The script within was dense, flowing, and uniform, suggesting a single author, but unlike Alston's philosophical descent, this was a journal of auditory obsession. The entries, dated from 1928 to 1929, detailed a scientific inquiry into sound, not pitch or volume, but the absence of sound. The author, who referred to himself only as the listener, wrote, "They dismiss the hum. They call it high frequency resonance or power lines. But the hum is the boundary. It is the static pressure of the world holding its breath. The spaces between the hums are expanding. That is where the truth is housed. We must learn to measure the negative space, the subtraction of noise." Elias felt a prickling sensation on his arms. He realized he had been unconsciously listening for the library's customary ventilation hum. It wasn't teeth there. The air conditioning, the low thrum of the building's heart had been subtracted. The only sound was the faint, predictable metallic tick of the corridor light switching its colors, the metronome of non-existence. In document a negative 37 negative 004, the listener described his attempts to record the negative space of sound. He detailed building a custom device, a microphone assembly insulated with a strange alloy and calibrated to register frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. "I have captured it, not sound, but the void where sound should propagate. It is not silence. It is pressure. It is a slow, rhythmic pulse. It is the key, the very silence between the heartbeats of." The writing in that entry abruptly stopped. The last word of was stretched and smeared, as if the pen had been torn suddenly from the page. Elias leaned closer, shining his lamp on the final word. The rust-colored ink was thick here. It was the same anomalous organic signature he de-analyzed in the black spiral, only mixed with iron compounds, creating the unsettling hue. It was impossible. Contained biological residue. He felt the metallic smell of the vault intensify, the scent of copper and old blood. He lifted his gaze, scanning the periphery of the vault where the light struggled to reach. The pulsed light from the corridor outside, still cycling with its agonizing rhythm, now felt like it was doing more than just illuminating. Each quick flash of the impossible, non-existent color seemed to burn a fragment of reality away. The silence of the vault was absolute, and Elias felt the growing certainty that he was not only listening for the space between heartbeats, but that the universe was now listening for his. He quickly moved on. He had a quota of 10. He needed to be mechanical to avoid dwelling on the content. He selected 4 more notebooks, these bound in faded blue canvas with an extremely fine minute script. A negative 37 negative 007 through a negative 37 negative 010. These were filled with complex, almost religious philosophy. The handwriting so tiny, it required a magnifying glass to read comfortably. The final 4 documents spoke of the unwoken, a state of being that was neither life nor death, residing in the folds of unused time. The author, who called himself the executor, argued that mankind was constantly awake, existing in a state of eternal screaming consciousness, and that the only true escape was to achieve the final subtraction, to willingly remove the self from the continuum of observed reality. Elias was halfway through, reading a chilling passage about the method of subtractive transcendence, a detailed list of cognitive and physical practices designed to delete one's own existence. When the rhythmic cadence of the corridor light stopped, the silence that followed was not just an absence of noise, it was a physical blow, a sudden, stunning pressure drop. Then the lights outside Vault 37 did not return to yellow. They settled on the impossible color. The entire corridor outside was bathing in that dark purple, black hue, a color that actively consumed the light and made the air feel thin. The black spiral in document a negative 37 negative. One felt hot in his satchel. Elias slowly raised his head. In the deep, unilluminated corner of the vault, in the oppressive dark that had previously been empty space, he could now see a subtle shape. It was tall and impossibly thin, a vertical line of pure, geometric shadow. It was so perfectly two-dimensional that his brain struggled to identify it as an object. It wasn't T standing in the corner. It was a subtraction from the corner. A sliver of the room. S geometry had been removed, and the resulting void was now perceiving him. Elias reached for the flashlight, his hand trembling. He had 10 documents indexed. He had met his quota. He had to leave. But before he could move, a new sound cut through the silence. It was not the grinding door or the static tick of the lights. It was a faint, almost delicate sound emanating from the pile of notebooks on the stone altar. It was the sound of dry paper rustling, not a sudden shift, but a slow, deliberate turning of a page. Elias stared, frozen, at the mass of paper. The movement had come from the very center of the pile. He knew, with a sinking horror that reached beyond reason, that the executor had just turned the page to the next step of the subtractive transcendence, and the listener was now listening, waiting for the gap between Elias' heartbeats to expand. The assignment was complete, but the archivist was now the archive. Elias didn't wait to see the source of the sound. The single, deliberate rustle of paper was more terrifying than any scream. A scream was biological expected. A mechanical action executed by a dead artifact was a breach of the natural order. His training, drilled into him through years of academic caution, was supplanted by pure adrenal panic. He spun on his heel, halogen lamp swinging wildly, and stumbled toward the massive iron door. As he moved, the geometric void in the corner, a tall, impossibly thin shape, seemed to lean with the light, maintaining its two-dimensional orientation. It was not a shadow. Shadows bent and stretched according to light source. This was a flat plane of absolute nothing, and it felt like the corner of the room had just become a portal to a dimension, defined solely by absence. He shoved the door open, not caring about the shriek of metal, and scrambled out into the corridor. The atmosphere was instantly worse. The purple, black light had not faded. The entire corridor was submerged in that subtracted color, an inverted luminescence that made the air feel viscous and heavy. Elias felt a dull, sickening pain behind his eyes, the physical strain of perceiving a hue that the human optical system was not built to register. He bolted the vault door shut, his hands fumbling with the heavy slide bar. It slammed home with a clang that felt muffled and distant in the sound. Deadened space. He ran. He didn't follow the pulsing yellow and black rhythm of the lights, because the lights weren't cycling anymore. They were frozen in the non-color. Elias sprinted up the concrete stairwell, taking the cold, spiraling steps 2 at a time, fueled by the vivid memory of the missing rug diamond and the excised milk carton. The contagion was real. The logic of subtraction was loose. He burst into the ground, floor archives office at 4:30 a.m., gasping, sweat plastering his shirt to his back. The main office, with its fluorescent lamps set to a steady, unapologetic white, seemed blindingly sane. Dr. Vane was already there. He was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the dawn darkness of the campus quad. He turned slowly, his expression utterly neutral. Thorn, Vane said, confirming Elias' arrival as if he merely paused a conversation. You seem agitated. Did you complete your quota? Elias leaned against a file cabinet, trying to catch his breath. Yes, sir. 10 documents, but Vane, this is beyond archival work. The materials are active. They are physically altering reality. I have spectroscopic proof. The ink is impossible. I saw geometric distortion in my apartment, and just now, in the vault. In the vault, Vane stepped closer, his colorless eyes finally showing a flicker of something. Not concern, but keen, analytical interest. The corridor lights settled on the impossible color. The ventilation hum is gone, and the notebooks, they are moving. I heard one turn its own page, and there was a structure in the corner, not a shape, but a subtraction from the space. A pure, two-dimensional void. Vane reached out and touched Elias, arm his grip surprisingly strong and cold. The two-dimensional observer, he murmured almost fondly. Professor Alston called that the guardian of the final theorem. You are seeing the principles in action, Thorn. Excellent. You have the necessary sensitivity. Elias recoiled. Sensitivity, sir? This is an existential threat. These aren't just notes. They are instructions for unmaking reality. We need to burn them. Seal the vault with concrete. Vane smiled, a thin, dry movement of his lips that did not reach his eyes. Mr. Thorne, you have indexed a -37, -007 through -010. You know the goal of the executor and the listener was to achieve subtractive transcendence, to escape the eternal screaming consciousness of this reality. You and I are the only two people who now have access to that knowledge. Why, precisely, would we destroy it? Vane walked back to his desk and sat down. Bring me the rest of your index notes. We need to consolidate. Then I have a more specialized task for you, one that requires your newfound sensitivity. Elias spent the next hour documenting his findings for Vane. He transcribed the spectroscopic data, detailing the impossible structure of the ink, the stripped organic compounds, the metallic void. He described the authors, Alston, the listener, focused on auditory subtraction, and the executor focused on self, subtractive transcendence. Vane listened, occasionally nodding, never once taking his eyes off Elias. When Elias finished, Vane opened a drawer and produced a leather, bound folio, pristine and untouched. Professor Silas Alston was a remarkable man, Vane began, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality of a lecture. His work on non-Euclidean geometry was groundbreaking. He realized that the axioms of space, time, and matter we take for granted are merely a low-level, predictable encryption. His final hypothesis, contained in a document you haven't yet reached, was that if you could find the locus of subtraction in any given system, you could introduce the proper non-Euclidean variable and negate the system's existence. Vane tapped the spiral notebook, a -37, -001. That Elias had retrieved. This notebook, Thorn, is Alston's initial working draft. It outlines the concept of the unwoken, entities that exist in the dimensional gaps, in the silence between heartbeats. The ink, as your machine confirmed, is the perfect vector, matter that has undergone partial self-subtraction, making it inherently receptive to dimensional breaches. But why? Why index it? Elias demanded. This is dangerous. Alston vanished. Vane leaned back, a dark amusement in his pale eyes. Alston vanished because he successfully found his own locus of subtraction. He ceased to be observed. He achieved his own version of transcendence, failing only to take the entire library with him. And that, Thorn, is where we must now correct his error. Elias stared. Correct his error. Are you trying to? I am trying to stabilize it, Vane corrected sharply. The vaults were sealed to stop Alston's contagion from spreading. But the contagion is not the madness, Thorn. It is the knowledge. By reading and indexing, you are not catching a disease. You are building an immunity through understanding. Your task is to find a counter equation, to find the structural axiom that anchors this reality. Vane placed the leather folio on the desk. This contains the original full index of the restricted B section, compiled by the Miskatonic curators in 1932. It's incomplete, but it mentions a document that was removed before the vault closure, the Alston Corpus Volume 0. It's the key. It was Alston's personal journal that predates the madness, a record of his final, sane thoughts before the geometry started failing. The curators removed it, fearing it contained the final trigger. It is not in Vault 37, but it is still within the Miskatonic system. You must find it. It may contain the addition needed to counter Alston's subtraction. Vane opened the folio and pointed to a single cryptic entry in old fountain pen script, ACV.0, location, the unused ledge, North Tower apex. Go, Thorn, Vane commanded. Find Volume 0. And remember, the longer you stay away from the material, the less resistance you'll have to the geometric decay. The archive is your shield. Elias left Vane's office, the leather folio clutched tightly in his hand. The search for the Alston Corpus, Volume 0, felt like a desperate quest to find the instruction manual for the world's self-destruct mechanism. He found his way to the main library stacks. The public archive, a comforting maze of wood, paper, and light that had always represented order. He used the library's internal catalog to cross-reference Alston, Silas, and North Tower apex. Alston was listed as a professor of mathematics, 1912 to 1931, specializing in complex geometries and theoretical cosmology. His published works were neatly shelved, dry and rational treatises on Euclidean failures and the possibility of hyper-dimensional space. Elias ignored the published works. They were the lie. He headed toward the North Tower, the oldest section of the Miskatonic Library. The tower was a 19th century granite structure, usually closed to the public and reserved for the most ancient and forgotten texts. The climb was strenuous. The air grew thinner, the granite steps spiraled higher, and the silence began to feel oppressive again, reminiscent of the vault. When he reached the top floor, a vast circular room filled with ancient glass-fronted bookcases, he found the access door to the apex locked. It was an old-fashioned lock, a tumbler mechanism requiring a specific, heavy brass key. Elias realized with a jolt that the key he used for Vault 37, the serpentine relic, was almost identical in weight and feel. He pulled it from his pocket. The serpentine key had two distinct cuts. He tried the first cut. It slid home, but wouldn't. He tried the second, smaller cut. Click. The lock turned with a soft, authoritative finality. The door creaked inward. The North Tower apex was a tiny, dusty attic room, illuminated by a single, high, arched window overlooking the waking city. The room contained nothing but a single built, in wooden shelf, the unused ledge. Resting on the ledge was a single, plain black journal. It was bound in heavy, untreated leather and secured with a thin, tarnished silver clasp. Elias reached for it, his glove brushing the leather. This was ACV.0, the Alston Corpus, Volume 0. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, flowing, and deeply scholarly, completely different from the frantic scrawl in the vault notebooks. It was a log of philosophical progression, dated 1925 to 1927. Alston wrote about his initial hypothesis that the universe was governed by a single, colossal equation, and that the only way to observe its true form was to find the point in reality where the fundamental variables were at zero. Hypothesis: all perceived reality, all geometry, sound, and color exists merely as a product of addition. To find the source, one must seek the void where the mathematical function returns to its origin. This void is not absence, but the prime axiom itself, the silence between the heartbeats of God. My initial attempts to induce this state by a complex topological subtraction proved too violent. The resulting geometric failures were localized, but catastrophic. See notes on the red ledger. I must find a more controlled method, a subjective subtraction. The last entry in the journal, dated April 1927, was a single cryptic sentence, written meticulously in the center of the final page. The anchor is the observed truth. The locus is the unobserved lie. I must now cease to observe the truth of the center and focus on the lie of the periphery. The key is in the mirror of the library, as oldest bell. Elias closed the corpus, his hands shaking. He had found Alston. Sinal same thought. The man wasn't just observing madness. He was attempting to achieve it as a scientific escape route. The anchor is the observed truth. Elias realized the library was the anchor, the organized structure that held reality together, and the notebooks in Vault 37 were the tools of the unobserved lie. He knew what Vane wanted. Vane wanted Alston as key, the controlled method. But Elias now suspected Vane wanted to use the method, not reverse it. Elias returned to Vane. Office, the Corpus Volume 0 in hand. Vane took the black leather book without a word, opening it directly to the last page. He read the final sentence. The key is in the mirror of the library, oldest bell. And a look of profound satisfaction settled on his pale features. Excellent Thorn, the final piece. The mirror is a reference to the ceremonial bell tower. Of course, the ancient bronze bell in the main rotunda, and the mirror. It implies a reverse or inverted observation. Alston was looking for the subjective subtraction point. Vane placed ACV point. Oh, in a secure, fireproof vault behind his desk. Your next task requires you to move beyond indexing. You must locate that bell tower, and more importantly, understand the unwoken more intimately. The unwoken, Elias repeated, dread pooling in his stomach, the term from the executor, notes. A negative 37, negative 007 to negative 010 suddenly felt less like philosophy and more like taxonomy. Yes, entities that exist in the folds of unused time, Vane clarified, echoing the executor. Words. Alston believed time was a river, but also a paper scroll. If you could press 2 points together, you could create a fold, a temporary space, where the unwoken reside, shielded from the noise of our conscious reality. The executor, the author of a negative 37, negative 007 to negative 010, was attempting to synchronize with them, to remove his conscious self and occupy a fold. How does that relate to the bell? The bell is the synchronizer, Vane explained, standing up and walking to the window. It was cast in 1799. Its resonance frequency is unique, low and powerful. When struck, the sound pulse doesn't just travel through air. It travels through matter, through the bedrock. Alston theorized that the frequency, when observed in reverse, could act as the non-Euclidean variable to create the temporal fold. He needed to be physically present at the focal point of the mirrored sound wave. And the geometric observer in the vault, the subtraction in my apartment? Elias asked, trying to ground the conversation in tangible terror. Vane turned back, his expression severe. Those are secondary effects, Thorn. The geometry is failing because the core axiom structure is being negated by the knowledge you are absorbing. The two-dimensional observer is merely a geometric representation of a zero variable point. It exists, but only as a lack. Vane handed Elias a small olive-green ledger, one from the listener set, a negative 37, negative 003. The listener says final note, a negative 37, negative 006, ended mid sentence. I want you to go to the rotunda, to the bell. You will use the principles outlined in this book to try and measure the silence of the bell, not its sound. You must find the precise locus of the inverse resonance. Elias took the book. It was thin, brittle, and the rust-colored ink felt sticky beneath his gloves. He knew this was the point of no return. Vane was using him as a living probe to test the parameters of Alston's ultimate experiment. Elias made his way to the Miskatonic Rotunda, the enormous, circular main hall of the library. It was a monumental space of polished marble, vast arches, and a ceiling dome painted with faded celestial charts. High above, nestled in a small enclosed cupola, was the legendary bell. He climbed to the second level of the rotunda, where a narrow balcony offered the best view of the bell tower. He was alone, the silence of the massive hall amplifying the frantic pulse of his own heart. The air felt charged, expectant. Elias opened the listener's ledger, a negative 37, negative 003, and began to read the instructions for measuring negative space. They were complex, involving cognitive focus and a specific application of non-Euclidean spatial thinking. One must visualize the geometric distance between two physical points, not as a straight line, but as an imaginary vector pointing away from the local gravitational field. As he concentrated, trying to force his mind to follow the impossible geometry, the rotunda began to change. Elias was leaning against a massive square marble pillar. He glanced down at the floor, which was composed of polished granite tiles arranged in a perfect grid. As he looked, the grid began to undulate, not physically, but perceptually. He could see the physical grid, yet his mind was registering a second, overlapping pattern, a grid where the lines failed to be parallel. He closed his eyes, but the geometry persisted behind his eyelids. When he opened them, he realized the effect was spreading. The massive marble pillar he was leaning on suddenly looked wrong. He could perceive all four corners, but when his brain tried to map them into a three-dimensional cube, the faces refused to meet at right angles. The top surface of the pillar seemed to be slightly bent inward, a perfect invisible curvature imposed on solid rock. Elias gasped, staggering back. The logic of subtraction was not just excising objects, it was editing the fundamental laws of space. He forced himself to focus on the bell tower high in the dome. According to Alston, the mirror of the oldest bell was the locus. He pulled out his halogen lamp, the same one he used in the vault. and aimed the beam at the bronze bell. The instructions in the listener's book suddenly made chilling sense. To observe the mirror, he had to observe the reflected absence of its sound. The bell, standing silent for decades, represented pure, contained resonance. Elias closed his eyes again, placing his free hand on the listener's book. He forced himself to subtract all sound, the buzzing of the external city, the pulse of his blood. He focused on the bell, visualizing the massive bronze surface as a membrane, and then visualizing the exact center point of the air inside the bell's cupola. That center point, where the sound wave should originate, was the zero variable. As he did this, the rotunda's silence fractured. It wasn't the sound of the bell ringing, but something far worse. A slow, heavy, rhythmic gong, felt not in his ears, but in the center of his skull. It was the negative pressure wave, the resonance of anti-sound. The impossible geometry around him intensified. The floor seemed to peel away slightly from the walls, creating a hairline crack of dark, purple, black, the color that did not exist, along the seam. The bell tower itself seemed to vibrate, not from mechanical action, but from a sudden subjective dimensional shift. Elias felt his body grow cold, numb. The executor's voice filtered through the fine print philosophy of a negative 37, negative 007, whispered in his mind. The final step requires the loss of the perceived body. Let the geometry fail. Embrace the fold. He opened his eyes. He saw the bell, and reflected in the bronze where his own face should have been, was a subtle, two-dimensional sliver of darkness. The two-dimensional observer he had seen in the vault corner, looking back at him from the mirror of the bell. He was standing at the locus. He had completed Vane's task, but he had opened the fold. Elias knew with crystalline certainty that he had to get back to the vault. The answer is not in the beginning, volume 0, but in the residue, the thousands of notebooks waiting to turn their own pages. The reflection was the final, devastating piece of evidence. The two-dimensional observer was not just an inhabitant of the vault. It was a consequence of the knowledge. It was the negative space created by Elias. Sewn attention on the non-Euclidean axioms. The sliver of darkness in the bell's bronze surface was his own perception, subtracted from three-dimensional reality and observing him from the fold. Elias broke the concentration, violently shaking the listener's ledger off his hand. The book fell with a brittle clatter onto the marble floor. The rhythmic anti-sound gong ceased instantly. The perceived bending of the marble pillar snapped back to its Euclidean rigidity. For a breathless moment, the entire rotunda seemed to sigh, settling back into its comfortable, observed truth. He looked at the bell. The reflection was normal now, showing his pale, terrified face staring back. The anchor is the observed truth. Alston's sane voice echoed from volume 0. The library itself, with its rules, its cataloging systems, and its massive fixed geometry, was the anchor that was preventing the world from achieving total subtractive transcendence. Elias had been focused on the lie of the periphery, the vault notebooks, while Vane had been trying to use the observed truth, the bell, the anchor, as a focusing lens. He snatched up the ledger, his mind racing. Vane didn't want to stabilize reality. He wanted to re-anchor it around himself, using the bell's locus to enter the fold and gain control over the unwoken, the entities of unused time. Vane was trying to become the new primary observer, the architect of the final geometry. He had to get Volume 0 back. It contained the complete, controlled method. He could destroy the notebooks, because the books were the symptoms. Volume 0 was the cause. He descended the rotunda stairs, the marble steps now feeling solid and predictable beneath his feet. He began to practice the addition Alston wrote about, consciously observing the structure of the world around him. He noted the perfect right angles of the door frames, the precise parallelism of the handrails, the consistent 90-degree intersection of wall and floor. He used his archivist training like a mental mantra, affirming the Dewey Decimal System, accession numbers, and the precise, boring truth of the physical world. The further he got from the rotunda, the more stable his perception became. But as he turned toward the administrative wing, the library's layout began to play tricks on him again. He saw a familiar sign, Administration Finding Acquisitions, but the arrow pointing down the corridor seemed slightly too long, and the letters of the word acquisitions appeared to vibrate as if some of the serifs had been temporarily subtracted. Elias realized that the geometric decay wasn't T-random. It was strongest near the vault, and it had been amplified by his interaction with the bell. Locus, he needed to return to the source of the resistance, the residue of the vault itself. He had to find a notebook that documented the failure of the subtractive hypothesis, the notes of an author who had tried to leave reality but had been forced to return. That return journey would contain the counter equation. Elias navigated the sub levels with a new terrifying level of awareness. He no longer saw the library's basement. He saw a temporary arrangement of matter held in place by fragile mathematical axioms. The fluorescent lights, which had settled back into their weak, continuous yellow, now appeared to him as a series of constant, tiny, added points of light masking the inevitable blackness between them. He reached Vault 37. The bolt was still secured. He unlocked it, the grinding shriek no longer terrifying, but merely the expected sound of a door resisting non-Euclidean entry. Inside, the vault was calm. The piles of notebooks were still, but Elias perceived a subtle, radiating pressure from the stone altar. He didn't use his halogen lamp immediately. He relied on the dim, ambient overflow from the corridor. He walked to the center of the notebooks and began sorting by script again. He was looking for a pattern that was disciplined, not frantic. He found a block of 10 thin, gray composition books bound together with a black waxed cord. They were marked a -37 -011 through a -37 -020. The handwriting was meticulous, clinical, and contained not a single word of English or Latin. The pages were filled entirely with the mutated Greek symbols he had first seen interspersed in Alston's math notebook, a -37 -001. Alpha with too many legs, Omega with a misplaced loop. These weren't T language, they were a subtractive cipher. He took a -37 -011 and a -37 -012. Setting them on the clean corner of the altar, he realized the notebooks were arranged in a kind of chronological, conceptual order. A -37 -001. Alston S. Math. The hypothesis, subtraction equals void. A -37 -002. Red ledger, the observation, failing geometry. A -37 -003 to -006. The listener, the variable, auditory subtraction, anti-sound. A -37 -007 to -010. The executor, the final goal, subtractive transcendence. The new set, the subtractive cipher, had to be the mechanism, the detailed instructions for performing the dimensional fold. Elias pulled out a -37 0001 again, holding the original spiral notebook next to the cipher. He focused on the mutated symbols adjacent to the calculus. He saw a pattern, a symbol that looked like a sigma with a diagonal slash through it appeared adjacent to an equation for dimensional integration. A modified pi with an extra hook sat next to temporal variables. It wasn't a language to be read, but a set of geometric instructions. The mutations were not errors, they were non-Euclidean modifiers on standard mathematical functions. Elias worked for 20 minutes, his mind dangerously immersed in the logic, until he decoded a single, repeating phrase. The cipher translated the foundational principle of all 10 notebooks. The path out is the path in, but the exit requires the key of the returning variable. Elias slammed the books shut, stepping away from the altar. The returning variable. One of Alston's colleagues must have attempted the transcendence, failed, and documented their necessary return. That person would know the addition needed to counter the subtraction. He needed to find the notebooks documenting the failure and the forced return. He searched the pile near the edge of the stone table, where the books looked slightly more water, damaged and abandoned. Underneath a loose stack of pamphlets, Elias found a thin, white envelope sealed with a brittle Miskatonic University wax stamp. It wasn't a notebook. It was a formal document designated curator. S-log, restricted B-37. He opened it gingerly, the paper crackling like dry leaves. It was handwritten, dated August 1931, signed by 2 curators, whose names Elias recognized from old university records. Men who had died of stress-related illnesses. Shortly after the vault sealing, the document was a confession detailing the final days of Professor Silas Alston's group. The geometric failure accelerated exponentially after the Bell incident. The 24th of July, Alston was no longer present in the 3-dimensional world, though his writings continued to appear on the altar. The others, the listener, the executor, persisted, attempting the full transcendence. We observed objects vanish, geometric corners fail, and the air itself become toxic with the non-color. See attached color analysis, which we can no longer view. Our attempts to destroy the manuscripts fail. The paper is chemically inert, and fire refuses to consume the impossible ink. We realize the books are not the danger. They are the residue of the experiment, documenting the existence of the fold. The great danger is the locus of subtraction itself, which we believe to be centered on the stone altar. Elias looked at the altar. The stone table looked like a sacrificial slab. We cannot destroy the locus. Our solution is this. To anchor the fold, we will use the weight of the organized archive itself, the vast Euclidean structure of the Miskatonic Library, to pin the locus down. We have gathered the last known notebook of the group, a series of documents detailing the forced return of Alston's primary student, Miss Clara Hess. Her notes contain the only known formula for addition. The curator, S-log, stopped abruptly on that page. Elias flipped to the final section, a hasty scrawl. We secured Hess' return notes, a -37 -021 onwards, and placed them not with the residue, but directly under the altar inside the indentation, the very focal point of the subtraction. The pressure of the books above, the weight of the marble and the counter, formula below may temporarily anchor the locus. If the notes are ever disturbed, the fold will collapse instantly. Elias looked beneath the stone altar. The bowl-shaped indentation, which he had seen earlier, was exactly where the log described, and now he saw a faint edge of white paper jammed into the tight gap between the stone and the granite floor, directly at the center of the indentation. He knew what he had to do. He had to disturb the anchor. Elias slid his gloved fingers into the gap beneath the altar. The paper was stiff and brittle. He pulled, agonizingly slowly. The movement was imperceptible, but the moment the paper shifted, the entire vault gasped. The air temperature dropped by 20 degrees in an instant. The stone table gave a deep subterranean groan that vibrated through his teeth. Elias successfully pulled out a single, thick, white laboratory notebook. Its cover was blank, but the first page was clearly marked in a neat, feminine script. A negative 37 negative 021. The Hess log. He quickly secured it in his satchel. He dared not look at the other sheets, still wedged beneath the stone. He rushed out of the vault, bolting the door behind him. The sound was a dull, satisfying thud. The sound of reality being temporarily affirmed. He needed to get back to Vane's office, read the Hess log, and simultaneously devise a plan to retrieve Volume 0. But as he sprinted down the long, concrete corridor, the familiar geometry of the library stacks failed catastrophically. Elias ran past an aisle marked 500 to 510, pure mathematics. He knew his path to the central staircase. He was 30 feet from the junction. He blinked, pushing past the constant effort of mentally affirming the Euclidean space. When he opened his eyes, he was standing at an aisle marked 790 to 800, theater and drama. He hadn't turned a corner. The corridor had simply folded itself. He tried to retrace his steps, running back to where the mathematics aisle should have been. It was gone. The aisles were now arranged in a maddening, illogical maze, separated by distances that made no sense. He could see one corridor ending in a solid wall, but he instinctively knew that if he walked 5 feet further, that wall would become a seamless opening to a different section entirely. The subtractive cipher was loose in the library, actively editing the path of his perception. He pressed himself against a cold concrete wall, forcing his breathing to slow. He closed his eyes and began to affirm the anchor. The wall is flat. The floor is level. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. He held the thought with an archivist's iron will. When he opened his eyes, the geometry hadn't fixed, but he could now perceive the lie of the stacks. He could see the true, straight path overlaid with the folded, non-Euclidean path. He began to walk, stepping deliberately through the center of a bookshelf, a phantom image created by the fold, and around a bend that wasn't there. He was navigating by addition, actively seeing the non-existence of the fold. He reached the main staircase, gasping, but victorious. He had the Hess log, the counter, formula, and he had confirmed Vane's role as the orchestrator. He just needed Volume 0, the key to the mechanism to stop him. Elias burst into Vane's office. The day had arrived, and sunlight was streaming in, creating an unnervingly cheerful atmosphere. Vane was not at his desk. He was standing by the fireproof vault where he had stored Volume 0. He was dressed not in tweed, but in a heavy, dark blue oilskin coat suitable for a trip into a damp subterranean space. "Thorn," Vane said, turning slowly. He smiled, a genuine, unsettling smile that finally reached his pale eyes. "You are late, but you returned with the correct resistance. The geometric failure must have been quite intense." Elias pulled the Hess log, a negative 37 negative 021, from his satchel, holding it up like a weapon. "You used me, Vane. You knew this material was active. You wanted me to find the locus, the mirror of the bell, And now you have Alston's controlled method, volume 0. Controlled, yes, Vane agreed, his voice almost musical. He opened the fireproof vault, and volume 0 lay inside. I don't intend to stabilize reality, Thorn. I intend to improve it. This universe is a low fidelity encryption, a prison of parallel lines and mortal consciousness. Alston found the exit. I merely intend to manage the gate. You want to achieve subtractive transcendence? Elias whispered, horrified. Number, I want to achieve subtractive sovereignty. Vane corrected, drawing a small, heavy silver hammer, a ceremonial tool, from his coat pocket. The executor sought to remove himself. Alston sought to escape himself. I seek to remain, but as the only observer who comprehends the true geometry. When the fold collapses, I will be the one who dictates the new axioms. I will use the negative space of the unwoken as the foundation for a new perfected reality. And you, Thorn, will be my final proof. Vane pointed to the Hess log. Clara Hess failed. She was forced to return. Her notes contain the addition required to pull a consciousness out of the fold. That means, once I enter the fold, your knowledge of the Hess log will make you the anchor of return, my single necessary lifeline. I need you alive and highly suggestible. You want to escape, Elias said, his voice trembling but hardening with resolve. I know how the anchor works. I know the truth of the library, and I know the truth of the bell. Thorn, Vane countered. The locus has been prepared. The fold is open. The two-dimensional observer is waiting to meet its three-dimensional counterpart. Your job is done. Now, you will wait here. Vane reached into the open fireproof vault and took out a CV.0. He also picked up the serpentine key, the key that opened both the vault and the North Tower apex. I am going to the rotunda now to ring the final bell. The sound will not travel through the air. Thorn, it will travel through the bedrock, directly down to the locus in Vault 37, and simultaneously, it will pull the consciousness of the unwoken into the library. That is the moment I step into the fold. If you try to stop me, or if you interfere with the bell, the resulting geometric shockwave will subtract the entire main library in one swift, catastrophic act. You will become the silence between the heartbeats of Miskatonic. Vane turned toward the door, volume 0 and the silver hammer in hand. Wait, Elias shouted, throwing the Hess log onto the desk. If the library is the anchor, I can use the cataloging system, the structure, to find the flaw in your plan. Vane paused at the door, his pale eyes glittering with cold amusement. The flaw, Thorn, is that volume 0 is already subtracted from my observation. I no longer need it. I have the method, and now I have your attention focused precisely where I want it, on the books, while I use the bell. I'll see you in the next reality, Archivist. Vane stepped out, and the heavy mahogany door swung shut with a muffled, ominous finality. Elias was alone, trapped with the Hess log, the knowledge of the fold, and the sound of Vane. Hess' footsteps rapidly receding toward the central rotunda. The geometric failures in the stacks were proof that the fold was expanding. Elias had moments to read the counter, formula, and find a way to stop Vane from ringing the bell.